So it's been a wet dream of the biotech industry since a long time. They've always wanted to get rid of the GMO rules.
You're listening to EU Watchdog Radio.
Hi, I'm Joanna, Comms Officer at Corporate Europe Observatory. Welcome to EU Watchdog Radio, a podcast we share with Counterbalance, an NGO that is not only our friend and ally, but also our neighbor in the building Mundo Matonge in Brussels. In this episode, I will talk to my colleague Nina Holland about the intense lobby battle that the biotech industry has been waging to get its new generation of genetic modification techniques excluded from the European GMO regulations. GMO stands for genetically modified organisms, and this will mean that crops or wild plants made by using this new generation of genetic modification techniques will no longer be subject to safety checks, monitoring, or consumer labeling. The underlying keyword for today's episode is deregulation, and that is a complicated word because it can sound interesting, like it can sound that it will allow people and things to, go about their lives more easily, not so burdened by bureaucracy. However, what deregulation here actually refers to is the scraping of rules to protect health and the environment. Deregulation is an argument that is used by the industry whenever they don't want to be supervised and their products to be, regulated and maybe even labeled to tell consumers how they were produced, as it is the case with GMOs.
That is what deregulation is about. It is literally, in this case, scrapping of rules entirely for a category of risky products, GMOs, for a section of for the latest technologies of genetic engineering, also called gene editing, but also for some other genetic techniques that already existed. So it's been a wet dream of the biotech industry since a long time. They've always wanted to get rid of the GMO rules. The rules are that there is a risk assessment. It's by far not sufficient, but it does exist. It assesses some risks for the environment, for human health. Then it completely scraps mandatory labeling for consumers. So you can no longer recognize on the packet whether you are buying GMOs or not. It will scrap traceability, so that in case of any accidental release or whatever, that you can find out where it has been marketed. And the last problem is that it will increase the problems and the dependencies for farmers that will be faced with many more varieties of crops that are in fact patented.
We cannot go on without addressing the core issue here: GMOs, genetically modified organisms. As the name indicates, they are organisms whose genetic material has been altered using genetic engineering in the labs. And this is a very different process from plant breeding, which has been carried out for many centuries by farming communities, by choosing healthy plants with desirable traits that are already present in a species. The genetic structure of living organisms is extremely complex in its functioning, and because the different genes interact in ways that are not always known, modifying this structure can have unpredictable and unknown consequences. And then came new GMOs. CRISPR-Cas is the most well-known genome editing technique and is used to produce new GM crops, but for that matter also animals, bacteria and so on. It makes use of so-called gene scissors to cause a double-strand break in DNA at a targeted site. This cutting event causes alarm signals in the cell where it happens, and the cell starts a repair process. The result of the repair is called the edit, and genetic engineers hope it will deliver a desirable outcome. However, the repair process that happens with genome editing cannot be controlled by the genetic engineer. In addition, this editing phase is only one of 3 steps in the genetic engineering process, and the other 2 steps remain the same for CRISPR-Cas-made GMOs or for old-style GMOs. Unintended effects that can lead to changes in the composition of a GM crop food still happen, also using CRISPR-Cas. Therefore, a risk analysis for impacts on the environment and on health is still necessary. And that is precisely what the industry wants to get rid of.
So we're talking about environmental risks and human health risks principally. And that is because when you change the genome, you often create unintended effects as well. So you can have a different composition in the end, different proteins than what you would normally have had in these plants. So that can have a big impact both on, if it's grown massively on millions of hectares worldwide, then these plants are present there, they can also spread, therefore they change the environment. So this is one thing, but also it can lead to new allergies or things like that. So you do need to have a check for human health as well.
What consequences can it have for consumers?
For consumers, it will no longer be possible to recognize whether you're buying GMOs or eating GMOs on the package of the product, but neither will it be possible for shops or for retailers or food processors to recognize what they're buying. It will only be possible for the farmer to see what they grow, but after that in the food chain, nobody can distinguish between the products. So that really poses a big problem for the GMO-free and the organic sector, which have a growing share of the clients, because they have to make sure that they stay GMO-free. But it's really difficult to distinguish between what is GM and what is not GM in the future. So it really creates new burdens on those that try to stay GM-free, and those that want to mix everything up, they have a free ride.
What will this mean for farmers?
So for farmers, it will really be, they will be faced with a seed supply that is more and more dominated by just a few corporations. At the moment, the dominant ones are Bayer, BASF, Syngenta and Corteva, which used to be Dow DuPont. So these big multinationals, they will consolidate and monopolize the seed supply, the varieties that are on offer, even further. So you have less and less choice. And for the small breeders, it will be harder and harder to compete. That is an effect of patents as well. And what the risk that farmers run is that if by accident or in any other way these new GMOs end up on your field or in your supply, and you haven't paid the royalties, you can even be taken to court, like has happened many times in the US, where Monsanto took many farmers to court over so-called presence of GMOs on their fields. So you really create more dependence in this seed supply chain, and that is an essential part of our food chain. So we end up all, in the end, being more dependent on these few biotech firms, and because they are also the dominant pesticide firms, not coincidentally, this is really not a good thing for sustainable agriculture.
And what impact will it have on biodiversity?
So with each GMO, GMOs are usually grown for large quantities for monoculture. So these are going to be grown in large quantities. That is what you should assume. And the deregulation is not only for agricultural crops, but even for wild species. So basically, it would be allowed without any risk assessment to bring products on the market, not only that are meant for agricultural fields, but even that could modify wild species. So you basically introduce on a large scale varieties that might never have existed in nature with a different composition. And this obviously has consequences for the insects, for the soil. So the consequences could potentially be severe and drastic, and there won't be any way to retrieve them because there's not going to be labeling and traceability. So all these extra burdens and costs will fall onto society, and not on the big polluters, which are Bayer, BASF, Syngenta and Corteva.
Now that we know what is at stake, Nina will walk us through what happened in the negotiations.
The last European Commission, they had this EU Green Deal. They wanted to cut down on pesticides, etc. Lots of beautiful promises. However, they also under the pretext of this EU Green Deal, said that they would deregulate new GMOs for the sake of sustainability. But there are no strong demands on this sustainability in this law of deregulation whatsoever. So they're not going to be forced to deliver on that. Although some countries still want to have those sustainability criteria. But so that was what the last Commission said. Instead, they just proposed a wild deregulation as a sort of a give-in to big industry, to these big seed companies, to not make them too upset about the cut down in pesticides. So they basically gave in after over 10 years of lobbying and pressure that these new GMO techniques should be deregulated. And they came with a proposal that completely scrapped all the existing rules for environment, for human health, and on labeling. And it has gone through various rounds of negotiation. It has gone through the European Parliament. The countries, especially Spain and Belgium, they really try to worsen the Commission's proposal even more by making it even larger, the category of GMOs that would be excluded from any regulation, making it almost without any limit. The Parliament, however, the previous Parliament has adopted a few improvements, like mandatory labeling, a bit more on environmental risk assessment, and a ban on patents for these new GMOs. So this is now what the European Parliament should be fighting for, because there's nothing in it anymore in the version of the Council.
And now we get to the complicated part of the fluctuating dynamics between countries, in particular Belgium and Poland, which, as we say in Portuguese, is where the pig twists its tail.
Belgium last year had the presidency, and the Agriculture Ministry completely took over and wanted to go for a very fast and radical deregulation. They didn't manage because in Poland, the farmers are very opposed to GMOs and to this deregulation, and they very much fear becoming more dependent. Also, the seed companies in Poland were very opposed. So to a very, very high level, they put pressure on Poland to cave in and to vote in favor of this proposal, but they never did. And this is also thanks to the Agriculture Minister Sikierski in Poland, who kept strong on this point of not wanting patents.
Now, brace yourself for the plot twist.
However, now it's Poland's turn to be the president of the EU. And suddenly the dynamics changed, and the eagerness to just finish a file that some bureaucrats really see as their prime victory has become more important, apparently. In addition, there's been lots of lobbying at all levels towards Poland, to the seed companies, to the government. So the big seed companies, the big biotech multinationals, Bayer, BASF, Syngenta, Corteva, they set up this platform called ACLP. It's a licensing platform in order to undermine this resistance to patents. So they hold the bulk of the patents. They set up this new platform to say, breeding companies, you can become a member and we'll share our patents with you. But of course, everything is voluntarily, so there's no guarantee. And since its foundation 2 years ago, only one company has joined, so they grew from 9 to 10 members. So it's not something that is actually appealing to seed companies. So this ACLP platform, they did an event in Poland for seed companies, trying to get them to join, so that would create a reason for the Polish government to say, okay, well, our seed companies seem to agree that now the patent issue has been resolved by this voluntary platform, so let's just give in on this. In any case, in early this year, 2025, they published a proposal that completely gave in to all their previous demands. So there's the Polish presidency put a proposal forwards that basically didn't do anything for labeling for consumers, didn't do anything to ban patents. The only thing that is there is saying that companies could voluntarily disclose patent information on their varieties, which is nothing because it's voluntary. So there's no, you can't rely on that, obviously.
And the bizarre situation is that in the meantime, Belgium got a new government, which now has a lot of reservations to this proposal.
And has brought out a statement where they are demanding risk assessment, mandatory labeling, and a ban on patents. So it has become a little bit the reverse situation, the world a bit upside down. And unfortunately, there now was a qualified majority to start the negotiations on this really bad proposal, on the basis of this really bad proposal from Poland. So now that means that the trilogues will start, which is the phase where the three institutions will negotiate. And that is still then at the end, all countries need to agree to the final outcome. And there are still several member states with serious reservations. From 3 countries, the agencies on risk assessment, so from France, from Germany, and from Austria, they all have severe reservations on the impacts of a complete deregulation of GMOs and the risks that might cause.
The deregulation of GMOs was presented at the time of the European Green Deal as a trade-off to the cut-down of pesticides. But when the European Parliament finally voted the pesticide reduction law, it was completely hollowed out and voted down. But now we're still having the deregulation. So the big agri-based companies profit from both the loss of the pesticide reduction law and from the deregulation of new GMOs.
Big biotech corporations have always really disliked the European rules around GMOs, especially the risk assessment, but also the mandatory labeling for consumers, because there's large consumer rejection. People in Europe don't want to eat GMOs, nor in other parts of the world, but there consumers cannot distinguish. So they basically saw their chance with this new generation of techniques, gene editing techniques, by simply saying these are not GMOs. That didn't really work because in 2018, the European Court decided that yes, these are GMOs. So they should be regulated as such with risk assessment, labeling, etc. And that really spurred a change of strategy among the proponents of biotechnology and biotech crops. The institutes, the developers, the big biotech multinationals, they said, well, if this is what the law says, then let's change the law.
That's how they started to push for a new regulation that would separate this kind of GM crops and completely scrap the rules for them.
So there's basically a new law. And they convinced the von der Leyen Commission to actually come forward with such a proposal. So in CEO, we requested over the last many years all the lobby documents from the European Commission that they got from corporate lobbyists, institutes, whoever, on this issue of deregulation of new GMOs. So we've been able to reconstruct who's been lobbying and how they did it. So in our report, Derailing EU GMO Regulation, we exposed these different tactics, and that included GM developers organizing meetings here in Brussels where they handpicked officials from national ministries and basically tried to create a like-minded group of bureaucrats in the national ministries to help them lobby those governments and to get intelligence from those governments so that in the council they would be able to lobby better and to maneuver. Mm-hmm. They also had a big task force which was hugely biased in its composition, started by a think tank called Reimagine Europa, and they got a huge grant from the Gates Foundation. And this task force, they developed the legal strategies and the so-called propaganda, the sort of flagship projects for these great new GMOs, the examples of which applied in a realistic scale we still haven't seen. And there was a platform called EU SAGE, which pretended to represent over 100 research institutes around Europe, that they would all be in favor of this deregulation, which was not at all the case. It was mostly individual researchers, and these often have a conflict of interest because they are involved in the development of the technology and often have a stake in the patents. So this is really what is behind it. It is a sector that is very far removed from farmers' realities, that is mostly interested in big monocultures, in large-scale uptake of their technology, rather than actually making agriculture adapted to local circumstances and farmers more independent. So that is why this deregulation attempt is really detrimental to society at large.
As Nina mentioned, Bayer, BASF, Syngenta and Corteva are the dominant biotech seed firms, and they are also the dominant pesticide firms. Often these two are linked with herbicide-tolerant crops, so they produce a very potent herbicide, which has another set of problems on itself, but then farmers that use it have to buy from the same companies seeds that are resistant to the herbicide. So it's easy to understand how these companies have been part of the lobby to deregulate from the very beginning.
They have invested a lot of money in this lobbying with big events, of course, this lobbying would be coordinated by their lobby groups at the EU level, for instance, by CropLife EU or Euroseeds. They were all part of these projects that I previously mentioned, such as this task force by Reimagine Europa. But also they really try to foster relations with researchers at public research institutes or public-private research institutes and try to give this a veneer of science. So even though the Commission proposal is highly unscientific because it gives a very random number of genetic modifications below which everything can be deregulated, and it has no basis on that they are safer or not. They are basically trying to give a scientific veneer to the pro-deregulation campaign by involving a lot of these researchers, so that it doesn't just come from these big dirty industries, but instead from researchers that are seen as more unbiased. But then we have a great report by the Greens in the European Parliament that actually expose how many of those researchers actually have a stake in this technology and in the patents on this technology.
We're almost at the end of this episode, but before we go, it's important to mention that the EU is a signatory of the Cartagena Protocol, which belongs to the Convention on Biological Diversity. It is the UN convention that tries to protect life on Earth. And under this convention, they talk a lot about biotechnology because it's a potential threat to biodiversity. The Cartagena Protocol states clearly that you shouldn't be lowering protection levels and also requests labeling. So by deregulating and not labeling, the EU will be in breach of this protocol. And all this effort from the agribiz giants can make us wonder, can we not live without GMOs? What will happen if we do not have them?
Well, we don't have them. That's the point. Yeah. Like in Europe, we hardly grow any GMOs. We don't eat GMOs. Only the cattle eats GMOs. And this is the genetically modified soy coming from South America that is made resistant to the herbicide Roundup and is causing all sorts of havoc there. So these are the really bad examples. It is actually so that conventional breeding has been much more effective so far to create, for instance, drought-resistant crops or insect-resistant crops. Because you start from a larger variety and you see what works in the environment instead of just manipulating one gene. All the promises that are made on, for instance, boosting productivity or drought resistance, actually these are really complex traits. And it's much better to select them from a larger population in the environment or on a field rather than trying to change one or two things, because the whole organism needs to change if it wants to use less water. So actually conventional breeding has been fairly successful there. But it's, of course, where does the money go? So if all the private capital, but also increasingly the public research funding goes to biotechnology, then that is where the so-called results will be. Whereas if instead you would be putting this money in organic breeding, boosting that and multiplying that among farmers and promote the uptake, then you would see results there. So it is really also where you decide to spend your money.
My last question to Nina is, what can we do about it?
So the next steps are that the Commission and the Council, which is the member states, and the European Parliament will start negotiating. This will happen over the next months. And so it's really important that people that are concerned about this, organization, groups, movements, that they give a loud and clear message to these decision makers. So to the members of European Parliament involved, to their own country's government. Petitions will be set up that they can sign, or they can write their own letters, make their own phone calls. So it's really important to take part in these activities, maybe set up an action, a public demo, something like that, in your national capital. All of these things will be really important because, the ones that take the decision will need to see and feel that people care about this topic, and that will create some pressure against this deregulation.
We have come to the end of this episode. If you liked it, make sure you follow EU Watchdog Radio. Send us your comments and share it with your friends, and check out Counterbalance and Corporate Europe Observatory on social media. Till next time, bye-bye.